Hey friend, please subscribe. 1 second for you. Big deal for me.
My name is Michael Harris. I'm 42 years old, and for nearly 2 decades, I dedicated my life to the same company. When I first walked through those glass doors as a junior analyst, I never imagined I'd spend so many years there, climbing my way up, sacrificing nights, weekends, and even moments with my family to help build something bigger than myself. That company became like a second home, until the day it turned into a public stage for my humiliation. It happened during one of those company-wide meetings where everyone is packed into the main hall, 100 employees staring forward, waiting for the CEO or his chosen few to talk about growth, projections, or some new, bold vision. I had been through dozens of these meetings before, but this one was different. The CEO's daughter, recently promoted into a leadership role she neither earned nor understood, was standing at the podium. She was sharp-tongued, impatient, and hungry to prove herself. And that morning, she decided to prove it at my expense. I remember the sting in my gut as she called my name out loud, her voice slicing through the silence, accusing me of failure, blaming me for numbers that didn't add up. I knew the figures. I knew the truth. But before I could even process the lie, she snapped her fingers toward security and barked, "Escort him out." That's when everything slowed down. The room fell into silence. 100 pairs of eyes locked onto me as if I were some criminal being paraded before judgment. My throat was dry, but I forced myself not to say a word. I stood tall, refusing to bow my head, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. Before I took a single step toward the door, she spat one last line, her voice echoing through the hall. "This mess is on you!" And just like that, the place erupted into chaos. Voices rising, whispers spreading, the kind of energy you feel in your bones when everyone's too stunned to hide their reactions. That moment, being cast out, humiliated in front of my colleagues, my peers, people who knew my work better than anyone, burned itself into my memory. But what she didn't realize was that she had just lit a fuse connected to something far bigger than her temper tantrum. Before I continue this story, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop a comment and let me know. And while you're here, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened after that meeting changed everything. I walked out of the hall with security at my back, but I wasn't crushed. I wasn't beaten. If anything, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Years of dedication, years of silent observations, years of watching decisions being made in smoky boardrooms and seeing numbers shuffled in ways that never quite added up, they all came back to me in that moment. The CEO's daughter thought she had stripped me of my dignity in front of the entire company, but as I stepped through those doors, I knew something she didn't. The truth was on my side. And truth, once it comes out, doesn't just hurt, it destroys. That day, they thought they had buried me. But what they didn't know was that they had just given me the perfect stage for my revenge.
When I walked out of that meeting hall with the weight of 100 stares still burning into my back, my mind didn't go blank. It drifted backward, through years of memories, through every sacrifice I had made for that company. The humiliation I had just endured wasn't just about that morning. It was about every late night I had stayed in the office, every weekend I had missed with my family. Every part of myself I had poured into building their empire. And now, in a single outburst, it was as if all of it had been erased. I started at that company in my early 20s, fresh-faced, hungry, willing to prove myself. I remember my first desk, a cubicle with a flickering fluorescent light above it, where I sat long after others had gone home, learning the systems, memorizing the numbers, figuring out how things truly worked. No one asked me to stay late, but I did. I believed hard work would speak louder than politics, louder than nepotism, louder than any shortcut. For years, that belief carried me forward. By my 30s, I had built a reputation. People came to me when something went wrong because they knew I would fix it. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but I was steady, reliable. The kind of man who didn't just put out fires, I prevented them. And for that, I earned the respect of my peers. Or at least, I thought I did. What I didn't realize back then was that in companies like ours, respect from peers doesn't shield you when the people at the top decide to play their own games. It doesn't protect you from bloodlines and last names. I saw men and women who had half my experience promoted simply because they played golf with the right executive or toasted champagne at the right dinner table. And when the CEO's daughter joined the company, it was as if the rules bent even further. She walked in with zero experience, but from the beginning, everyone knew her mistakes would be forgiven, and her victories, no matter how small, would be magnified. Still, I kept my head down. I told myself my work would matter in the end, and for a long time it seemed to. I spearheaded projects that saved millions in costs. I reorganized teams that were on the verge of collapse. I turned chaos into order, time and time again. People joke that if you wanted something fixed, you gave it to Michael Harris. But what did that earn me? A plaque here and there, a handshake from the CEO in front of the staff, promises of bigger roles, better positions, promises that never came true. Looking back, I can see it clearly. I wasn't meant to rise any higher. I wasn't family. I wasn't one of them. I was just the man who kept their empire from falling apart while they reaped the rewards. I remember one project in particular. It was the merger of two divisions, a logistical nightmare that everyone had quietly backed away from. I worked on it for 9 months straight. Nights in the office, weekends blurred into weekdays, papers spread across my kitchen table. My wife used to shake her head when she saw me still awake at 2 a.m., scribbling notes and crunching numbers. But she never complained. She believed in me. She believed that the sacrifices would mean something in the end. And when that merger succeeded, when the profits soared, and the CEO boasted about it at the annual conference, do you know who he thanked? Not me, not the team that bled to make it happen. He thanked his daughter for her vision. She had attended 2 meetings, contributed nothing but a few buzzwords, but in the end, the credit fell at her feet. That was the moment I began to understand the truth. The hierarchy wasn't built on merit. It was built on power, names, and proximity to the man at the top. The rest of us were expendable, useful tools, nothing more. Still, I stayed. I stayed because I believed the company needed people like me, because I believed I could protect the teams beneath me, shield them from the incompetence above. And perhaps in some ways, I was afraid to leave. After so many years, who was I without this place? My identity had fused with the company. My blood, sweat, and hours were woven into its fabric. So when the CEO's daughter humiliated me in front of everyone, I didn't just feel anger. I felt betrayal. Betrayal not just from her, but from every year of loyalty I had given them, from every moment I had traded with the hope that it would one day be recognized. But betrayal has a way of clearing your vision. For the first time in years, I saw the company for what it really was. And in that clarity, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just a discarded employee. I was the man who knew where the cracks were hidden, the man who had patched them time and again, the man who had seen the foundation rotting beneath the glossy exterior. And I knew something then that she didn't. When you spend years holding an empire together, you also learn exactly how to watch it fall apart.
When the CEO's daughter first walked into the company, I knew immediately that the rules had changed. Her name was Rebecca Stone, though most people just called her Miss Stone, with a stiffness in their voice, as if afraid that forgetting the title might cost them their jobs. She was in her late 20s at the time, fashionable, confident,
and completely unqualified for the position she was given. I remember the way she carried herself through the office on her first day, high heels clicking against the marble floor, head tilted slightly upward as though the very air inside the building belonged to her. She didn't look at us like colleagues, she looked at us like subjects. Some employees tried to welcome her, to ease her into the rhythm of things, but she brushed them off with cold politeness. From the beginning, it was clear. She didn't come here to learn. She came here to rule. Her office, which had once belonged to a senior vice president with 20 years of experience, was remodeled almost overnight. New furniture, custom artwork, a massive window desk that overlooked the city skyline. It wasn't just an office, it was a throne room. Meanwhile, the rest of us were still crammed into cubicles with recycled chairs and computers that froze every other day. At first, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. I told myself she would learn, that she would grow into her role. Maybe her father wanted her to earn her stripes in the trenches like the rest of us. But those illusions faded quickly. Within weeks, she was barking orders without understanding the projects. She dismissed the concerns of managers who had been there longer than she had been alive, and every mistake she made, every costly oversight, was swept under the rug. I'll never forget one particular incident. We were finalizing a contract with a major supplier, one that would secure millions in revenue for the year. Rebecca wanted to push for impossible deadlines that would drive costs through the roof and strain the relationship with our supplier. I raised my concerns in a private meeting, calmly explaining the risks. She leaned back in her chair, smiled, and said, "Michael, I appreciate your input, but we're doing it my way." We did it her way. The deal almost collapsed. It took weeks of scrambling, endless calls, and quiet favors to repair the damage. But when it was finally resolved, do you know who got the credit? Rebecca. She stood on stage at the quarterly meeting, thanked for her bold leadership, while I sat in the back, exhausted, knowing I had saved her from disaster. Moments like that piled up, mistakes disguised as victories, failures dressed as triumphs, and through it all she carried herself with an air of untouchable superiority. No matter how wrong she was, her last name erased the consequences. Employees whispered about her in the break room, but only in hushed tones. Everyone knew the risk of speaking too loudly. Promotions were granted or denied at her whim. Careers rose and fell based not on performance, but on her mood that week. People who once took pride in their work now walked on eggshells, afraid of catching her attention in the wrong way. And yet, despite the fear, I could see it in their eyes: resentment. They resented her arrogance, her ignorance, her entitlement, but none of them dared to confront her. None of them dared to stand against the daughter of the man who owned everything. I, however, didn't have that luxury of blind obedience. I had been there too long, seen too much. I knew the truth behind the polished walls and glowing press releases. I knew that her carelessness was more than just an annoyance. It was dangerous. And while she flaunted her power, I began to notice something else: cracks in the foundation. Rebecca had access to financial reports she barely skimmed, legal documents she didn't understand, contracts she signed without reading. Her arrogance made her sloppy, and her sloppiness made her vulnerable. And because I had been the one quietly fixing the chaos she left behind, I saw where the weaknesses lay. I saw where the numbers didn't line up, where the deals were riskier than they appeared. For years, I patched up those cracks. I told myself I was protecting the company, protecting the employees who depended on their paychecks. But in truth, I was protecting her too. Every time I saved her from the fallout of her own mistakes, I was enabling her. It wasn't until that morning, the morning she humiliated me in front of everyone, that I realized I had been holding back a storm. She thought she had destroyed me with her words, with her display of power, but what she didn't know was that I had been carrying the weight of her incompetence for years, and now, stripped of my position, I had no reason left to keep protecting her. That was the beginning of her downfall. Not because I sought vengeance in anger, but because I finally understood. Sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't in what you do, it's in what you stop doing. For years, I had been the quiet observer, the man in the background who kept everything from falling apart. That's the thing about being reliable. People begin to take you for granted. They hand you their problems, they pile on the mess, and they trust that you'll clean it up without complaint. And I did. Not because I was weak, but because I believed in something larger than myself. The company, the people who worked there, the idea that loyalty meant something. But every time I fixed a broken deal or cleaned up after Rebecca's reckless decisions, I noticed things, details, patterns, loose threads. At first, I ignored them. I told myself it wasn't my place to question the people at the very top. But once you see enough cracks, you can't unsee them. It started with contracts, agreements that didn't quite add up, payments funneled through subsidiaries that didn't seem to exist, figures massaged until the numbers painted a picture far prettier than reality. At first, I chalked it up to creative accounting, the kind of gray area most big companies dance around. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping. It was deliberate. Rebecca was reckless, but her father, the CEO, was something else entirely. He was cunning, ruthless. He built his empire on foundations of smoke and mirrors, and for years no one questioned it because the profits kept rolling in. Investors were happy, employees were paid, and as long as the machine kept humming, no one cared how it really worked. But I cared. Maybe too much. So I started keeping things, not at first with any plan in mind, but out of habit. A misfiled contract here, an unedited draft of a financial report there, emails that contradicted official statements, spreadsheets with numbers that told a very different story than the ones shared at board meetings. I tucked them away, quietly, carefully, not to use them, but because some instinct told me I might need them one day. Years went by, and my little archive grew, a hidden drive, locked away, encrypted. Documents, copies of reports, even voice recordings from meetings where things were said that would never survive on paper. I never intended to bring any of it to light. I thought, foolishly, that the company would change, that my loyalty would eventually be rewarded, that truth would find its way without my intervention. But loyalty is a dangerous thing when it's not mutual. The morning Rebecca ordered me out of that meeting, I realized that all those years of silent collection, all those files gathering dust in the shadows, weren't just scraps of paper. They were leverage. They were power. And more than that, they were justice waiting to be served. Because here's the truth. The CEO's empire wasn't as indestructible as he wanted everyone to believe. It was fragile, brittle, held together by deception and intimidation. And I knew exactly where to press to make the entire structure shake. I thought back to a night years earlier, when I had stumbled across a draft report that hadn't yet been sanitized for the board. It revealed massive debt hidden behind inflated revenue projections. I had a copy of that. Another time, a vendor complained quietly about bribes they were forced to pay to secure contracts. I documented that too. Dozens of little things that on their own might not mean much, but together they painted a damning picture. Rebecca thought she had silenced me when she humiliated me in front of those employees. She thought she had cut me out of the picture. But what she didn't know was that my departure freed me. As long as I was inside the company, I was bound by contracts, by fear of losing my position, by the illusion that loyalty might still matter. Once she cast me out, I was no longer bound. And with that freedom came clarity. I wasn't going to fabricate lies. I wasn't going to sabotage systems or plant evidence. I didn't need to. The truth was enough. All I had to do was open the vault I had been building for years and let the world see what was inside. That realization settled over me like a calm wave. Revenge didn't have to be loud. It didn't have to be chaotic. Sometimes, the most devastating revenge is silence, the quiet reveal of everything someone tried to hide. Rebecca believed she had destroyed my career. What she had actually done was remove the last barrier between her father's empire and the truth. And truth, once unleashed, doesn't just wound, it consumes. When I left the company that day, security escorting me through the glass doors as if I were some criminal, I felt something I hadn't expected. Calm. Anger, yes, it burned in my chest like a slow fire, but beneath that anger was a stillness I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in almost 2 decades, I wasn't chained to their deadlines, their chaos, their lies. I was free. And freedom has a way of sharpening a man's vision. That night, I sat at my kitchen table long after my family had gone to bed. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. In front of me was my laptop, the hidden drive connected, the vault of documents I had collected over the years. Page after page, file after file, I scrolled through them, watching the empire of the CEO laid bare in numbers and words. If anyone else had seen what I saw, they would never look at that company the same way again. For hours, I sat there, my finger hovering over the trackpad, the weight of a decision pressing down on me. I could bury it all, pretend it never happened, start over somewhere else, walk away with nothing but a bruised ego and the quiet knowledge that I had once been the keeper of secrets. Or I could act. But here's the thing about revenge. It tempts you to act rashly, to lash out, to destroy without thought. That wasn't who I was. Rebecca had humiliated me with noise, with her shouting, her spectacle, her arrogance. I wasn't going to answer her with the same weapon. My revenge would be silent, patient, and undeniable. I started making a plan. The first step was to organize everything. Years of saved files don't mean much if they're scattered and chaotic, so I built folders, timelines, connecting dots between fraudulent reports and shady contracts, piecing together a story that no board of directors, no government investigator, no journalist could ignore. The truth wasn't just in isolated mistakes, it was in the pattern, the web of deception that connected everything. The second step was deciding who should see it. Dumping the information online would create noise, yes, but it could also backfire. People would question its authenticity, dismiss it as a disgruntled employee's fantasy. No, I needed credibility. I needed institutions, people with the power to act, regulators, financial watchdogs, journalists who had been circling the company for years, sniffing around the edges but never able to get close enough to bite. And finally, the third step, timing. Timing is everything. I couldn't just release the information at random. I needed to wait until the company was vulnerable, until the smallest push would send the whole thing collapsing like a house of cards. Over the next few days, I worked quietly, methodically. I contacted a trusted journalist under an alias, feeding small pieces of evidence to gauge their interest. Their response was immediate, hungry, almost desperate. They had suspected fraud for years, but they had never had proof. And suddenly, I was their proof. I also reached out, anonymously, to a government agency I knew monitored financial irregularities. Nothing direct, nothing that could trace back to me, just enough to set their radar buzzing. It wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about justice, about balance. Rebecca thought she had stripped me of everything, but in truth, she had stripped away my last reason to keep quiet. And now I was no longer bound by loyalty, fear, or contracts. I remember standing in front of the mirror one morning, days after the meeting, looking at my own reflection. I didn't see defeat staring back at me. I didn't see a broken man. I saw a man who had carried too much for too long, finally setting it down. A man who had been underestimated, dismissed, and silenced, but who held the one thing they could never take from him, the truth. And so, the decision was made. I wouldn't scream, I wouldn't shout, I wouldn't beg for validation. I would simply open the door and let the truth walk out into the world. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't in the noise of destruction, it's in the silence that follows when lies finally collapse under their own weight. It didn't take long for the first cracks to show. At first, they were subtle, so subtle most people wouldn't have noticed them. But I'd lived inside that company long enough to recognize the signs. The empire that had seemed so untouchable, so permanent, was trembling. And it all started with whispers. The journalist I had contacted published their first piece. Nothing explosive, not yet. Just a carefully crafted article about unanswered questions in the company's financial reports. On the surface, it looked harmless, a small stone tossed into a lake. But I knew better. That article wasn't the explosion. It was the spark. And sparks spread faster than anyone anticipates. Within days, emails started flying inside the company. I knew because former colleagues, the ones who still respected me, began forwarding them to me quietly. Nervous memos from the legal department, frantic replies from finance, meetings hastily called late at night, with subject lines like urgent, press inquiry, and immediate response required. Rebecca, from what I heard, was livid. She stormed through the halls like a queen betrayed, demanding answers from people who had nothing to do with it. She wanted names, scapegoats, someone to burn at the stake to make her feel powerful again. But this time, the fire she tried to light only cast more shadows. People were afraid, yes, but now they were afraid of her and of what might come next. Then came the vendors. A small supplier pulled out of a contract without warning, citing instability. That was unusual. Vendors don't just walk away from money unless they smell something rotten. Then another partner followed. Soon, the whispers weren't just inside the building. They were echoing across boardrooms in the city, across phone calls between investors. And then the stock price. It started with a dip, barely noticeable at first, a 0.5% loss here, another there. But markets are like vultures. They circle at the first scent of weakness. Investors read the article, saw the whispers, and began to ask themselves dangerous questions. Questions like, what if the numbers aren't real? What if the empire isn't as stable as it looks? Rebecca tried to silence the panic with a press statement. I read it, and it was laughable. Empty words about strength, long-term growth, and unwavering commitment. But anyone who's ever worked in finance knows when someone's trying too hard to sound confident, it's usually because they're terrified. And terrified they should be. Because what they didn't know was that the journalist's first article was just the beginning. I had only given them a fraction of what I had. Enough to stir the pot, not enough to reveal the feast waiting underneath. The real blow came when regulators picked up the scent. I had dropped breadcrumbs carefully, anonymously, making sure the trail led right to the vault of documents I had built. When the first formal inquiry was announced, just a short note on a government website, panic rippled through the company. That single announcement carried more weight than Rebecca's loudest screams. It told investors one thing: this company is under suspicion. And suspicion is poison. I heard that the CEO himself called an emergency meeting with top executives, doors closed, blinds drawn, voices raised. He had built his life on control, on being the man who always had the answers. But this time, the questions had no safe answers. Because every truth buried in those files was sharp enough to cut through his empire. I didn't celebrate, not yet. This wasn't victory. It was the first tremor before the quake. But I did allow myself a quiet satisfaction. Sitting at my kitchen table again, I watched the news scroll across the screen. Stone Enterprises faces scrutiny amid financial concerns. I leaned back in my chair, folded my arms, and thought, the fuse has been lit. The irony wasn't lost on me. Rebecca had thrown me out of that meeting in front of 100 employees, believing she had silenced me forever. But by trying to erase me, she had freed me. And now every headline, every nervous whisper, every nervous tick in the stock price was a reminder of the storm she had unleashed on herself. The first impact had landed, and it was only the beginning.
The day the collapse truly began was strangely ordinary. The sun rose, people went to work, traffic filled the streets. But inside Stone Enterprises, panic was spreading like wildfire. And outside, in the markets, the walls of their empire were already starting to crumble. I remember staring at my screen that morning, coffee in hand, watching the stock ticker. At first, it dipped slowly, like a boat rocking gently on the waves. Then, almost without warning, it nosedived. 5%, 8%, 10%. Investors were dumping shares like they were radioactive. And every red number on that screen told me the same story. The market had lost its faith. By noon, the company had lost hundreds of millions in value. Analysts on the news channels, the same ones who had once praised Stone Enterprises as a model of stability, were now dissecting every rumor, every headline, every whisper of fraud. It was as if the entire world had suddenly realized the emperor had no clothes. And the bleeding didn't stop. It accelerated. I got messages from former colleagues describing the chaos inside the building. Phones ringing off the hook, vendors demanding answers, clients threatening to cancel contracts. Employees stood in clusters in the hallways, whispering, scrolling through their phones, watching their retirement savings vanish in real time. Then came the number that made my stomach tighten, even though I had expected it. $150,000 per minute. That's how fast the company was losing value. Every 60 seconds, more than most employees made in a year was evaporating. The empire Rebecca's father had built over decades was dissolving minute by minute, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Rebecca, from what I heard, tried to take control. She marched into meetings, slammed her fist on tables, demanded action. But her words carried no weight anymore. Investors didn't care about her arrogance. Employees didn't care about her threats. The numbers were louder than she could ever be. And her father, the great CEO, looked smaller by the hour. For years, he had been untouchable, the man who always had the answers. Now he sat at the head of the table in silence, staring at charts that showed his empire collapsing. I imagined him realizing too late that the man he had dismissed, the employee his daughter had humiliated, was the one who had held it all together. I wasn't in those rooms, but I could picture it. Executives sweating through their suits, lawyers flipping through binders with trembling hands, consultants throwing around words like restructure and liquidity crisis. All of it meaningless. The foundation was rotten, and once rot spreads, no amount of patchwork can save the structure. News stations camped outside their headquarters, cameras flashing, microphones shoved into the faces of anyone who walked out. Former employees spoke up, confirming what the documents had revealed. We always knew something wasn't right. We saw things we couldn't explain. Every voice added fuel to the fire. And me? I didn't cheer. I didn't jump up and down or gloat. I just watched, calmly, patiently. Because this wasn't just about revenge. It was about balance, about truth. I hadn't needed to fabricate a single lie. All I had done was stop protecting them. The truth had been enough. That night, the stock closed at a historic low. Billions of dollars in value erased. Commentators spoke of bankruptcy as not just a possibility,
but an inevitability. The name Stone Enterprises, once synonymous with power and prestige, was now synonymous with failure and corruption. As I sat there, the memory of that meeting came back to me. The silence of the room, the weight of 100 stares, Rebecca's voice cutting through the air. "This mess is on you." She had meant it as a condemnation, but she had been right in a way she couldn't have imagined. The mess was on me because I had stopped cleaning it up, and without me holding it together, the whole thing collapsed. When the end finally came, it wasn't a fiery explosion. It was a quiet implosion. Stone Enterprises, once a towering symbol of wealth and power, filed for bankruptcy on a rainy Thursday morning. The headlines spread like wildfire. Stone Empire collapses amid fraud investigations. Investors panicked, employees wept, and the city that had once celebrated the Stones now turned its back on them. I sat in my living room, the television humming in the background, watching the coverage. Reporters stood outside the headquarters, cameras catching the defeated faces of employees carrying boxes out of the building. People who had once looked at me with pity as I was escorted out of that room were now packing their lives into cardboard. It was strange. I felt no joy in their suffering. Most of them were good people, people like me, who had given years of loyalty only to be betrayed. They didn't deserve this. But Rebecca and her father, that was another story. From what I learned, the CEO's final days in power were pitiful. He had always been the man with the answers, the one who commanded respect with a glance. But when regulators closed in and lawsuits piled up, his voice lost its weight. Executives abandoned him, investors cut ties, and the empire he had built with lies collapsed in his hands. The mighty CEO was reduced to a desperate old man begging for mercy in boardrooms where he had once ruled as king. And Rebecca, oh Rebecca, the daughter who thought she was untouchable, who humiliated me in front of 100 employees, who spat those words at me as if they were nails in my coffin, her arrogance was gone. I saw her face on the news one night, caught in a blur of cameras outside a courthouse. No more designer suits, no more confident stride. Just fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. She had become the symbol of everything that went wrong, the scapegoat her father could no longer shield. I should have felt triumphant, but what I felt was something different. Peace. You see, revenge isn't about rage. It isn't about screaming louder than the person who wronged you. It's about balance, about letting the truth do what it was always meant to do. Rebecca thought she destroyed me when she ordered me out of that room, but in reality, she freed me. She cut the last thread tying me to that corrupted empire, and in doing so, she gave me the chance to bring it all crashing down. And I never had to raise my voice. People sometimes imagine revenge as an act of violence, of fury, but mine was silent. I didn't swing a sword. I simply stopped holding up the walls of a rotting fortress. The lies collapsed under their own weight, and all I did was let the truth out of its cage. As I watched the empire burn from the outside, I thought back to that moment in the meeting hall, her words echoing, "This mess is on you." She had no idea how right she was. The mess was on me, because for years I had cleaned it up, and the moment I stopped, the world finally saw the truth. I didn't go back to the company. I didn't need to. My life was no longer tied to their rise or fall. I walked away with something they could never take from me, my dignity. And maybe that's the real victory. Because in the end, Rebecca and her father were left with nothing but ruins, their names forever tarnished, and me, I was still standing, quietly, calmly, with the kind of strength they could never understand, the strength of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. That's the lesson they never learned. Silence can be louder than any scream.